A VP flight was a combination of luxury and comfort. The world's wealthiest people often gathered together on such flights, traveling with a limited number of passengers, ensuring that their personal space was protected. The plane she was on was just such an environment. There were only a few passengers, each sitting comfortably in their own spacious seats, enjoying every comfort throughout the flight. But this flight was much more than an ordinary journey. As the woman looked out of the window of the airplane, she became increasingly uneasy. She was a famous American journalist and had been closely following recent political developments. After a long political career, she had recently become more vocal about how negative she felt about the Trump family and their policies. Donald Trump's re-election to the presidency, while it gave hope to many, instilled in him pessimism and anger. This election was a turning point, not just for America, but for the world at large. As the woman once again skimmed through the newspaper in her hand, she tried to let go of her anger, but she was unable to do so. The rapidly changing social structure, inequalities, and human rights violations were magnifying and deepening the rage inside her every day. In the back of the plane, he noticed Barron Trump, then in his 20s. Donald Trump's son was sitting quietly. Suddenly, she could not take her eyes off him. Barron was not a household name, but his presence symbolized the continuation of the Trump family. He was one of the youngest members of a family that has been at the center of Donald Trump's policies, a family that has exerted a powerful influence with every step. For many, Barron had to follow in his father's footsteps. His life was not just a family affair, but symbolic of the polarization that was being created across the country. The woman thought about Barron's life at a young age, living in the shadow of a large family. But these thoughts only made her angrier. At that moment, she decided to act out of anger. How can someone grow up in such an environment and still defend it, she thought. He walked up to Barron and raised his voice, saying that everything had to stop at some point. How can someone like you be so comfortable in this world, she asked. Barron was taken aback by her approach, because it was very unusual for him to be met with such a harsh approach. Unable to take it any longer, the woman vented her anger with every sentence directed at Barron. Her words were not directed against Barron, but against the system as a whole, but this would be difficult for him to understand. Barron remained silent in the face of her words. He said nothing. Emotionally, this moment could have affected him deeply, but from the outside, it seemed like an insult to a child. In that moment when she addressed Barron, he couldn't help questioning whether this anger inside him was the right way out. She had lost herself. She was trying to express the injustice of the whole world through a child. Barron fell silent, not wanting to feel her anger any longer. At that moment, regret appeared in her eyes. After all, how much can a child be blamed? He was just a teenager trying to find his own way. She realized how out of place every word she had said to Barron had been. Unfortunately, everything had already been said. This moment was a turning point in her mind. She admitted that her words had added nothing to him, but had only led to more misunderstandings. Directing her anger at Barron was not something she or her family could change. At that moment, a deep regret welled up inside her. Those few minutes on the plane had taught her a lot. The woman sat deeply in her seat, weighed down by her words to Barron. The silence on the plane had somehow affected everyone after the explosion a moment earlier. Only a few people were aware of the mutual state of the woman and Barron, but in general the rest of the plane continued their journey as if nothing had happened. At that moment, the woman was forced to question everything she had been thinking. As storms raged inside her, only one thing was clear. She understood that insulting Barron was not the right thing to do. She fell into silent contemplation. In that moment, her mind quickly went back in time, questioning how things started to turn in the world of politicians and the origins of her anger. For many years, her anger towards the Trump family had been a familiar feeling for her. The media coverage, the presidency of Donald Trump, the political turmoil caused by his family, had not left him with a good impression. This anger had become a big part of his life, but now he was expressing it through a child. Barron Trump was not that guilty. After this inner questioning, the woman took a deep breath. Her eyes looked out of the window opposite her. As the airplane sped across the sky, she suddenly realized that there was no need to bother herself anymore. Despising or insulting Barron Trump was not going to change her life. After all, he was just a kid. However, there was a more important question. He realized that he had to learn to control his anger. Anger had become a feeling that controlled her. Suddenly, the passenger sitting next to the woman summoned up the courage to call out to her. "Are you all right?" he asked, slowly and carefully. The woman immediately turned her head. She was overwhelmed by the situation she was in, by the silence and her thoughts. But the look of the man in front of her, combined with the regret inside her, shook her. There was no accusation on his face, only deep curiosity and concern. For a moment the woman felt the need to defend herself. But then she stopped. What was she really defending? She took a deep breath and continued to look into his eyes. I just lost control of my anger," she said slowly. "Sometimes the things you see are so big and complex that it's hard to control your emotional response. This was a memory I didn't want. Not everything I said to Barron was about insulting him, but anger sometimes blinds you. I understand." He nodded and smiled at her words. "I really do, but remember that the world Barron lives in is very different from the world we live in. After all, he is just a child." The woman listened carefully to what he said. Lost in her own thoughts and anger, a stranger so clearly and calmly reminding her of the facts gave her a very different perspective. She hadn't noticed Barron at the time, or to be more accurate, she had only seen him as part of her family. But as the man said, Barron was just a child. In fact, for him, there were so many pressures and challenges in life. Childhood was not something that came easily to him. They were silent for a while. There was a feeling of slowness in the airplane. After a while, the woman realized that the anger inside her was beginning to fade. Barron's attitude towards her only strengthened this feeling of regret. She accepted that everything happens for a reason. Sometimes you just needed to see the right person at the right time. She thought about how sorry she was for what she had said to Barron earlier. She wanted to get up and go to Barron. But then she realized something. There was sadness on Barron's face. After all, he didn't even need to defend himself. He was just silently enduring all that was going on inside him. She herself needed to apologize to Barron. But there was something else on her mind. This was not just about Barron, it was a social issue. The roots of this incident were not only the expression of one person's anger, but also a reflection of a deep conflict, a polarization in society. His anger at Barron was directed not just at one family, but at the social fabric of America. She had insulted Barron, but all her anger was directed at everyone. When these thoughts appeared in her mind, she realized that real change had begun. Inside the airplane, she had a deep inner reckoning. As she thought about the truth behind her harsh words and anger towards Barron, she realized that it was all just a misunderstanding. A child, no matter how famous or powerful, is still a child. Barron Trump was just a part of his family, and in that moment he realized how pointless the anger directed at him was. The regret inside him was growing by the second. He mustered up the courage to deal with the emotional burden, and slowly got up to go to Barron. The person she needed to see was not just Barron, but herself. She had to question why he had reacted to her in such a harsh, destructive, and senseless way. Her heart raced as she approached Barron, weighed down by her previous words. However, remorse and conscience were forcing her to do the right thing. There was nothing hostile or angry in this woman's demeanor as she approached Barron's face, looking into his eyes. Instead, she spoke to him slowly and calmly. "Barron," she said, sincerity in her voice, "what I said was wrong. I'm really sorry. It had nothing to do with you. I don't know you at all. But I forgot you're a human being. This doesn't belong to you." When Barron locked eyes with her, something changed in his eyes. This moment of confrontation was a turning point, not only for Barron, but also for the change in her. Barron was not just a little boy, but a symbol of America's past, present, and perhaps future. The reflection of the polarization and anger in society on an innocent child was reflected in her eyes. When Barron heard her apologize, he shook his head slightly, not reacting in the way that was expected of him. In fact, even his acceptance or rejection of this apology was outside the political and social turmoil he was in. After all, he was just a child and really didn't deserve to attach meaning to everything. But her words are the essence of a man's struggle against his own conscience. It was not only an act against Barron, but also a step towards understanding the conflicts within society itself. The woman calmly sat back down, without breaking Barron's silence. In that moment, she not only apologized, but also began to forgive herself. Barron had done nothing wrong. Directing his anger at a child only magnified the emptiness inside himself. She realized how fragile she herself was. No matter how much Barron's family or the political situation in America had touched him, this anger was his alone. And now, at last, he could see the emptiness beneath that anger. As the plane began its slow descent, the change in her was complete. Barron, to whom she had apologized, was in a way an expression of herself. She now had a different perspective. This short but intense encounter with Barron had not only taught her a lesson in humanity and conscience, but also reminded her how harmful the polarization of society can be. He had to find peace within himself, regardless of social tensions. After all, this encounter was not only with Barron, but with herself. When the plane touched down, there was a lightness in her. Perhaps she realized how much she didn't know Barron Trump, how much she had judged him. This simple but profound encounter had taught her a lot, and finally, looking at Barron, she found peace within herself, knowing that she had truly forgiven him and that her regrets would one day pass. Sometimes, it is only by confronting others that one's mistakes can turn into truth.